All right, we'll have the exams back on Thursday. It takes a lot longer than one would expect with over 100 exams, but we'll have them back on Thursday along with the results. Today, we're going to go back and revisit the Coase theorem with regard to the example that was covered in the review very briefly, because there's been a number of emails from a subset of the class asking questions about that, and I want to revisit it to make sure that everyone understands. In addition, we're going to move on and recognize that for many environmental goods, there is a real question about how to measure what the inherent value of different environmental goods. And this is going to take us back to the discussion we had about benefits and costs. And as we explained when we talked about demand curves and willingness to pay, those same concepts are going to appear once again. But now the problem is that we don't have prices on many of the environmental goods. So we have to devise other methodologies to be able to infer what those prices are with the ultimate objective of getting a willingness to pay. So the core concept is what is a consumer's willingness to pay, and we're going to look at different methodologies for estimating or capturing different consumers' willingness to pay for environmental goods. Now let me ask one question. If you look at the readings for today and the readings going forward in the balance of the course, the presumption is that you all know statistics. Now, one of you asked the question about one of the questions on the midterm example could be solved by calculus very easily, very quickly, but it can also be solved graphically. And one of you sent me an email just as I was leaving for lecture today, and the question was, I thought you said we didn't have to know calculus. I did say that. But I would have expected everybody to at least have one course in calculus before they got in this course. But if you didn't, you could have solved that problem without calculus. Now, coming to statistics, how many of you have not been exposed to regression analysis? Oh my gosh. Okay, I have to do a tutorial on regression analysis. Okay. But you've all had statistics, either in high school or here in college or AP statistics. How many haven't had any statistics? Oh my gosh. Okay, all right. Okay. For those of you who haven't had any statistics, I'll spend a little bit of time giving you a brief tutorial, but if you want more exposure, come to my office hours, and I'll spend what time's required to bring you up to a minimal level so you can assimilate much of the material that we're going to cover in the balance of the course. Fair enough? Okay. And because there are no prices for many environmental goods, we have no choice but to use non-market valuation methods. And that's what we're going to talk about in both today's lecture and in Thursday's lecture as well. And the first group of methodologies are referred to as revealed preference. Why revealed preference? Suppose you're, in a given weekend, you're sitting there making a choice of whether you're going to incur all the cost, time and travel, to go to Tahoe because you gain some value from the aesthetic scenery at Tahoe, versus going to Tilden Park. Right? We all know where Tilden Park is. Make it the Rose Garden. Okay. And suppose that you choose to go to Tahoe. Well, given the options that you were considering, if you went to Tahoe, you've revealed a preference that you prefer Tahoe. Right? That's what we mean by revealed preference. You have certain preferences, and when you make choices, those choices reveal something about your preferences. And ultimately, it reveals something about your willingness to pay as well. Because quite obviously, traveling all the way to Tahoe is going to be much more costly in terms of time, the opportunity cost of your time, travel cost, given current gasoline prices. It's going to be much higher than going to Tilden Park, right? Okay, so that's the basic concept. And we're going to look at three different revealed preference methodologies today, one of which is referred to as the travel cost methodology, which we'll see in a moment. Another is referred to hedonic pricing, and the third is referred to averting behavior. How do you avert environmental bads? And if you incur a cost in averting those environmental bads, suppose tap water is contaminated. What are your choices? One choice is to drink the contaminated water, right? But it's some risk to your health. Another choice is to go out and buy bottled water. What's the cost of buying the bottled water? That's a value that you can capture that gives you some basis for inferring what would be the value to you of having clean tap water or uncontaminated tap water, right? Okay, let's revisit Coase and take that same example that was in the review session of last Tuesday. And the reason that I want to come back and revisit this is not only that a number of students have sent me emails asking questions about it, but in addition, most people in the general population presume that whoever caused the harm, whoever is responsible for causing the harm, should be restrained. Should be restrained or should be taxed or should end up being controlled by the public sector. And what Coase's theorem demonstrates is that is not necessarily true. Because if, for example, the party causing the harm, if that party is adding in some other economic activity, adding real value, and you end up restraining them from adding that value, that may not be in society's best interest. Right? So in this example, there's A and B. A may inflict harm, but there's a reciprocal question about if I restrain the party that's causing the harm, then I may end up causing more serious harm in terms of, at the end of the day, the net benefits that can be generated. So the simple example that we looked at were two parties, and we could construct this with a number of different examples, and we get the same sort of outcome. Here there's a cattle raiser. He is raising and producing cattle, and there's a nearby farmer, and those cattle get out frequently and cause damage to the crops of the nearby farmer. And should we always find the best policy, the best public policy, is it to restrain the cattle raiser? What Coase's theorem says is no. It depends on the facts. And let's look at those facts. Here, a simple numerical example. In the first column, given the number of cattle, which are steers, which ultimately have value as they move through the food chain, and ultimately consumers have some willingness to pay for the meat once those steers are slaughtered. there is the damage associated with the crop loss of the adjoining property, and that's represented in the second column, the second column here, which is directly related to the number of steers. And note that the crop loss per additional steer is nonlinear. That is to say, the more steers, the greater the incremental loss in the production from the crop. Okay, if the cattle, now the question is, you can assign property rights any way you want. You can either give a property right to the farmer or you can give a property right to the cattle raiser, but once you've defined who has that property right, then one party is going to be liable. The first example that we look at here is that the crop producer has a property right to protect its crop from damage from the cattle, right? So under those circumstances, the cattle raiser would be liable with regard to any harm or damage that he causes on the crop production. And as we just saw in the table, if the cattle raiser starts with just 2 steers, those are the initial conditions, and suppose he considers adding a 3rd steer. To do so, if he's liable, he would have to pay the external cost that he is imposing on the crop producer, right? And that external cost for that incremental steer is $3. And that should be the cost that the cattle raiser bears as a result of a decision to move to 3 steers. And he should take that into account in his decision calculus, right? He should look at what are the incremental benefits and what are the incremental costs, and it turns out that those incremental costs must include the $3 of damage to the crop producer. So in the analysis of the decision that will be made by the cattle raiser is that he has to take his private marginal cost and add to that the $3 of damages that he imposes upon the crop producer. Now, if the cattle raiser is not liable, instead he has a property right for letting his cattle go wherever he wishes, which in some part of the world, go to India, for example. Cattle have property rights. Okay, suppose the initial size of his herd is 3 steers, and now you turn the marginal benefits and marginal cost upside down and recognize that the farmer would certainly be willing the crop producer, would be willing to pay $3 for the cattle raiser to reduce the number of steers from 3 to 2, right? Because if the cattle raiser is at 3, there's $3 of damages imposed upon the crop producer. So it's in his interest given this liability assignment, it's in his interest to compensate the cattle raiser to reduce the number of steers from 3 to 2. Now, in the decision calculus on the part of the cattle raiser, he has to realize that he can, when he looks at the marginal benefits and marginal cost of moving from 3 to 2, he can take into account the benefit that he can capture from the crop producer by reducing from 3 to 2 steers and getting a side payment from the crop producer of $3. Okay, and this is shown here on this particular graph. Now, looking at the marginal benefits is represented here as the production cost of the 3rd steer. That's going to be saved because you don't incur that production cost if you move from 3 to 2, right? And you'll get $3 from the crop producer. And when you look at the marginal cost, that would be the value of meat foregone by moving from 3 to 2 steers. Okay? The conclusion is, if you look at this simple example, and this is generally true in all examples of this sort, that the $3 of external cost that's imposed by cattle raising on the adjoining crop production, that is ultimately the cost of adding a 3rd steer, which must be included with all other costs. And going through that analysis, one will end up taking into account that $3 regardless of how property rights might be assigned between the 2 parties. And that is the key point. And it also says, if you fundamentally look at efficiency and you're concerned only with efficiency, it says that the underlying legislation in the United States, which says under all circumstances the polluter pays and or the polluter should be restrained, the Coase theorem says it's wrong. The legislation is wrong. It doesn't serve the public interest if the public interest is defined as maximizing efficiency. All right. The take-home message, I think I've already given that to you. This is on your slide deck from a week ago, Tuesday. And moreover, in this example, as in all other examples, the presumption is that transaction costs are nil. I mean, the 2 parties, the cattle raiser and the crop producer, can get together at a very low cost and work out what's in their collective best interest. If transaction costs, however, are material, then this kind of solution will not work. All right? Okay, let's turn to today's lecture, looking at reveal preference and the different methodologies, the 3 that I noted. Number 1 is the travel cost methodology. And for the reading for today, you'll see that in the late 1940s, Harold Hotelling wrote a letter to the director of the National Parks for the United States government, Department of Interior, and said, listen, I've got a methodology for valuing parks. By the way, you notice something else? You know when you go to Yellowstone or Yosemite, when you get to the gate, when you're going through the gate, they give you a little questionnaire that you frequently have to fill out? Okay, welcome to regression analysis. That's why you got to fill it out. They want the data. They want the data so they can do an analysis about, and they always ask you, from where have you traveled? Where's your home residence? You have to record that. And then they can use that information to impute what the travel cost of your visit, what travel cost you incurred to visit that public site or that public good. Right? Now, environmental benefits, as we've noted in prior lectures and your prior readings, they are really a source of externalities, whether those externalities turn out to be positive or negative. But one of the key features of externalities, if the government doesn't come along and impose a corrective tax, those externalities are not priced. Like, remember when we looked at competitive structures and then we went on and looked at oligopolistic structures and monopoly structures? The presumption was you had buyers and sellers interacting in the marketplace, right? And you achieve an equilibrium at the intersection point between demand and supply. But here, on the externalities, who are the willing buyers and sellers that are interacting in that market to determine the price? It doesn't happen. Right? So we have to recognize that these are non-marketed goods, and by non-marketed goods, I mean only that they're non-priced. Okay? So let's extend. Remember our circular flow diagram? I think it was in the second lecture when we looked at the relationship between households and firms. Now we're going to add the environment. what we have here, as we had in that circular diagram model, we have certainly the firms that are involved in production that are generating outputs. The outputs are purchased by households. They provide inputs, labor inputs, certainly for the firms. But now what we're recognizing in terms of that circular flow, there's all sorts of byproducts from the actual production process, and also from the process of moving goods and services, services in particular, to firms. There's travel, there is fossil fuels that are used in that travel, and those fossil fuels generate carbon emissions, and there are a number of other different types of bads in the sense that the price, if they were priced, they'd have a negative price. And on here, on the right part of this flow diagram, are all of the possible sources of degradation of the environment, and on this side are the inputs, some of which come from the environment directly, certainly air quality, water in addition, amenities, the example that we just talked about in terms of a visit to Lake Tahoe, all of those end up influencing the overall viability of this circular flow of goods and services. Now, why do we have to value the environment? But obviously, if its price is always treated as zero, it's going to be overexploited, and moreover, non-sustainable. And we'll visit the question of sustainability in future lectures. But for the time being, all I want to provide in this slide is why we should value the environment, because we want to take into account potential degradation and or augmentation of that environment that could well increase the productivity of the economy going forward if it's conserved and well managed. The fundamental point is that private companies, and or forget private companies, there's no need to point a finger at private companies, private households, each of us with regard to our own activities, if we generate externalities and it's not priced, then we will end up using too much of those scarce resources and generate too much in the way of bads, which I've labeled here as waste. Okay, so how can we go about valuing these environmental goods in the absence of an active market of willing sellers and willing buyers? Okay, there are certainly different values of environmental resources. We can all agree on that. And ultimately, the population that has access to these environmental resources have some willingness to pay. Just like when we're looking at a market for automobiles. There is a willingness to pay on the part of potential buyers of automobiles. And here, too, there is the same concept with regard to consumers valuing a particular environmental resource. Now, the total willingness to pay is composed of three major components. One is the use value of that resource. If you end up going to Yosemite or Lake Tahoe, you're using that resource while you're located there. So that would be in the first category here. What's the use value to you? A second value is the option value. And this we'll look at not today, but down the road. But the simple way to think about this is, who in this room hasn't been to the Grand Canyon? A lot of you have been to the Grand Canyon. Does it have some value to you of knowing it will be there when you exercise the option to go there? Right? Now, if somebody came along and destroyed it, that option would no longer exist for you, right? So it has an option value, and the fact that it is conserved and maintained means that somewhere along the line, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, or 30 years from now, you will seriously consider going. And the fact that today you have that option means it has some value to you, right? The third component is non-use values. And use values are fairly direct, which I've already explained. It's the willingness to pay for direct use of these different environmental resources. With regard to option value, the willingness to pay for the future availability. The Amazon is a wonderful example. Yellowstone is another example. Non-use values are existence values. And here, the question is, does society, does the general population put a value on preserving a resource even though you know you'll never use it? Maybe you'll get to see videos of it somewhere along the line, and you get some value from the videos. But you're not a direct user, and moreover, it's not an option that you want to maintain because you may or may not exercise it sometime in the future, but you place value on its existence. Now, when we come to quantifying the willingness to pay, it's a real challenge, right? How to figure out how one is actually going to quantify the willingness to pay that a general population has for the existence of something they're never going to use, and they're not going to seriously consider its option value with regard to some future potential use. And by the way, this existence value, if you listen closely to major environmental groups, they think this third component is more important than the first two. Right? Okay. Now, use values can be estimated using revealed preference. That is to say, look at people's choices, and then look at their choices, and whatever choices they make must have been preferred relative to the set of other alternative choices that they could have made. Right? Now, use values and option values non-use values and option values cannot be estimated through revealed preference. Instead, they have to be estimated through state preferences. Namely, you ask people. You design a questionnaire, and you determine their willingness to pay for option values or non-use values. And we'll be looking at that, not today, but in Thursday's lecture. Okay, revealed preference methods. I've already indicated we're going to look at three different methodologies that are out there. The travel cost method, the hedonic pricing method, and then finally, averting behavior. Those are the three methodologies we're going to examine today.